The house stood by a road that was rarely walked all the way through, not because it led nowhere, but because it did not lead toward anything specific. It existed between directions. Those who found themselves on it kept moving, not to arrive, but so the movement itself would not end too soon. At this hour, the lights inside the house did not turn on at once. They appeared gradually, room by room, as if the house took time to decide which spaces required light and which could remain dark without consequence. The difference was subtle, slow enough not to demand attention. The person who entered did not pause at the doorway. The threshold did not mark a beginning. It simply allowed what was already moving to continue inward. Shoes were left where the body stopped, without adjustment, without straightening, without the need to place them anywhere else. The floor was warm, not noticeably warm, just warm enough that walking required no effort. Steps continued at an even pace, not counting distance, not measuring space, simply continuing because that was how the floor allowed them to move. The first door stood slightly open. Inside, nothing required checking. A table occupied its place. The window reflected interior light rather than the outside. The air itself offered no change. Movement passed through without slowing. The door closed behind without sound, not through intention, but because motion carried forward. The next door appeared much the same. Any small difference faded as soon as it was passed. Some rooms held light, others did not. After a while, remembering which was which stopped mattering. The distinction dissolved into sameness. The hallway connecting the rooms did not begin or end. It simply connected. Steps repeated, paused, then repeated again, following a rhythm that did not belong to counting or timing. At moments, movement stopped, not from fatigue, not from decision. Stopping belonged to the same pattern as walking. Standing was simply another way the movement continued. In one room a chair waited. Sitting happened without choosing to sit. The body settled, then rose again, returning to the same steady pace. Nothing in the room reacted. Nothing needed response. The window in this room opened onto another corridor. If attention lingered, it became noticeable that the reflection moved exactly as the steps moved, never ahead, never behind. The hallway appeared again, possibly the same one, possibly another. The difference no longer mattered. The order of steps, pauses, and turns remained intact, requiring no memory. Light in one room faded, or perhaps it simply stopped being noticed. Movement continued unchanged. Doors lined the walls, some open, some closed. Their state carried no instruction. Passing them no longer suggested progress. Steps softened, not because the floor changed, but because sound blended into space. Light and shadow settled into the same background. The hallway shortened, or lengthened, or lost dimension entirely. Movement passed through without marking distance. Sitting happened again, elsewhere, with no noticeable difference. Standing followed, calm and unmarked. The sequence repeated without becoming familiar enough to notice. Rooms began to resemble one another, not visually, but in function. Each offered the same permission to pass through without engaging, without carrying anything forward. Doors no longer signaled entry or exit. They became part of the wall, appearing and disappearing as movement continued. Light remained. Light faded. Neither required attention. The house no longer suggested a path. It existed as a continuous interior where moving and pausing were equally equally possible, equally inconsequential. Steps returned, paused, returned again. The rooms stayed where they were. Light appeared and disappeared. Steps continued, paused or ceased. Nothing required attention to continue. The house no longer needed to be walked. Movement persisted on its own, steady and uninterrupted, no longer tied to direction or progress. What remained did not ask to be followed. Movement continued without requiring confirmation, not forward, not backward, simply present in the same way it had already been present for some time. The hallway appeared again, unchanged, familiar enough not to attract attention, repeating itself without precision, yet close enough that nothing needed to be adjusted. Steps returned to the same rhythm. Not quicker, not slower, returning exactly as they had before. A room opened without signaling entry. Light rested there briefly, then settled into the background. Nothing within the space suggested use or purpose. Passing through felt identical to remaining. The chair appeared again, or something like it. Sitting happened. Standing followed. The sequence completed itself without leaving a trace. The window reflected interior light once more. The reflection moved with the same steadiness as before, matching movement so closely that it stopped indicating motion at all. Doors remained where they were, some open, some closed, all equally irrelevant. The air held the same weight, neither heavy nor light, simply present, allowing movement to continue without resistance. Steps softened further, blending completely into the surrounding space. Sound no longer separated itself from silence. The hallway shortened, then lengthened, then ceased to suggest dimension. Passing through no longer implied distance. Standing occurred again, not as a pause, but as part of the same continuous motion. Walking resumed without transition. Rooms repeated, light repeated, movement repeated, not identically but closely enough that recognition replaced attention. Nothing accumulated, nothing carried forward. The house no longer suggested sequence. It existed as a continuous interior, where repetition did not imply return and movement did not imply progress. Steps continued, paused, continued again. Light appeared, faded, remained. None of this required watching. None of this required remembering. Movement persisted on its own, steady and uninterrupted, as though it had never depended on observation. What remained did not need to be followed. Movement no longer needed to establish itself. It was already there, continuing in the same way it had continued before, without adjusting pace or direction, remaining steady enough that it no longer suggested effort. The hallway appeared again, unchanged, familiar enough not to be registered, extending just far enough to allow passing through without noticing where it began or where it might end. Steps followed the same rhythm, returning to it naturally as if nothing else had ever been required. A room opened, then another, neither announcing entry nor marking exit. Light rested briefly in one space, softened in another, then blended into the background so completely that it became difficult to say whether it was present or simply expected to be. The chair returned, or something that served the same purpose. Sitting happened without preparation. Standing followed without marking the transition. The sequence completed itself and dissolved back into the movement. The window reflected interior light again. The reflection matched the pace exactly, neither leading nor lagging, remaining steady enough that motion no longer stood out as movement. Doors lined the walls once more. some open, some closed. Their position did not suggest choice. Passing them required no adjustment and no recognition. The air remained consistent, neither shifting nor thinning, allowing movement to continue without resistance. Sound softened further, no longer separating itself from silence, becoming part of the same uninterrupted field. Steps continued, paused, returned again, not as a cycle to be followed, but as a pattern already in place. The hallway shortened slightly, or perhaps attention no longer measured it. Distance lost its role. Passing through space became indistinguishable from remaining within it. Standing occurred again, not as a pause, but as another form of motion. Walking resumed without transition, as though it had never stopped. Rooms repeated, not exactly, but closely enough that familiarity replaced attention. Each space allowed passage without engagement, without accumulation, without carrying anything forward. Light appeared, softened, faded. None of it required acknowledgement. The house no longer suggested order or sequence. It existed as a continuous interior where repetition did not imply return and movement did not imply progress. Steps continued at the same pace, not faster, not slower. The chair appeared once more. Sitting followed. Standing followed again. The order remained unchanged, completing itself quietly. Somewhere a door closed, or perhaps it had always been closed. The difference no longer registered. The hallway returned again, indistinguishable from the last time it appeared. Passing through did not feel like moving forward or backward, only like remaining within the same uninterrupted motion. Rooms stayed where they were. Light remained. Movement continued. Nothing required watching. Nothing required remembering. What remained continued on its own, steady and uninterrupted, no longer dependent on attention. Movement remained steady, without needing to renew itself. Nothing shifted enough to require notice. The same rhythm carried on evenly, without pause or emphasis. The hallway appeared once more, unchanged, allowing passage without marking distance. Steps followed the familiar pace, neither adjusting nor hesitating, continuing as though they had never stopped. A room opened quietly into another. Light rested briefly, then softened, settling into the space without separating itself from shadow. The difference faded almost immediately. The chair appeared again. Sitting occurred. Standing followed. The sequence completed itself without leaving anything behind. Doors remained along the walls, open, closed, indistinct. Passing them required no response and no choice. Sound blended fully into silence. Footsteps no longer stood apart from the space that held them. The hallway shortened, or lengthened, or simply lost its dimension altogether. Movement continued without marking direction. Standing happened again, seamlessly. Walking resumed without transition. Rooms repeated, close enough to familiarity that attention no longer followed them. Each allowed passage without engagement. Light appeared, softened, remained. Nothing needed to change. Movement continued, steady and uninterrupted, existing on its own without requiring observation.